All right, so jumping back into our types of organic molecules. So, what we'll look at is what the type of the organic molecule is, the subunits that make up that specific type of molecule, what types of functions they have, and some examples that we might see uh, in nature. Okay. So, we're going to start here with carbohydrates. This is one I'm sure we all have heard a lot about, shortened as carbs. And so we see that all carbohydrates have essentially the same ratio of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So, glucose, for example, which is one of our subunits of carbohydrates, C6H12O6, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And we will see this across all carbohydrates. Okay. So our monosaccharides or simple sugars are our subunits or monomers of carbohydrates. So you will see this term monosaccharide used. We'll talk about disaccharides and polysaccharides, which are just longer chains of these carbohydrates. Okay. So monosaccharides are used as fast, really quickly available energy. You eat some glucose, your cells can use that right away. We break it down through glycolysis, and then it enters the whole cellular respiration cycle. Okay. Glucose is the most common of these monosaccharides. Okay. We also have fructose, which is a monosaccharide, which we find in that high fructose corn syrup, which is where that comes from. It's the sugar that we get from that corn. We have galactose, which is a part of that sugar that we find in milk. That lactose is actually a disaccharide, but galactose is a monomer that's part of that. And then we have ribose and deoxyribose, which are special types of sugars that we find in DNA and RNA. Okay. So disaccharides, that prefix di means two, saccharide means sugar. So we've got two sugars here. These are short-term energy as well. We just have to split these two molecules through hydrolysis, and then we can process that sugar for energy. So we have things like sucrose, which is your table sugar that you buy and add to all your baked goods, which is glucose and fructose. We've got lactose from milk, which is glucose and galactose. And then we've got maltose, formed with starch digestion, which is that sugar that we put in malts, that malt powder, which is a glucose and a glucose. So those are our types of disaccharides. And then we also have polysaccharides, which are longer chains of those monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, galactose, and so on. So polysaccharides can be dozens to hundreds or even thousands of monosaccharides long. And they get this big, but again, when we make these types of molecules, it's one by one monosaccharide. Okay. And these polysaccharides are more long-term energy. Think if you're about to run a marathon, you eat pasta. It's full of these carbs. So that when you're running for this long distance, you can start pulling that energy, breaking down those molecules and pulling the energy from that glucose that you get out of it. So we've got starches. This is how plants store their energy. So things like potatoes have a lot of starches in them. These are just chains of those glucose molecules. We have glycogen. This is how animals will store their energy. So we can break down these polysaccharides into glucoses. And if we don't need that glucose right away, we'll then build glycogen and we'll store that glucose in that form until we need that energy. We also have cellulose, which is kind of made special in plants, and many animals can't actually break that down, which when you want fiber to like defecate to help you poop, you eat things with a lot of cellulose because we don't break that down and it helps everything move right on through. And then chitin is a molecule that we find in the exoskeletons of a lot of insects, and that's just a matrix of these saccharides as well. Okay, so these are things to think about. What is a carbohydrate? What is a subunit or monomer used to build carbohydrates, and what are the functions? Okay? So when we're looking at what is a carbohydrate, we're thinking carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, 1:2 to 1 ratio. The subunit are monosaccharides, the most common of which is glucose. The most common energy source for living things, especially us as humans, is glucose. That's what we're best at processing. Okay. The functions of carbohydrates: quick energy when we're looking at monosaccharides or disaccharides as well, more long term energy for our polysaccharides. Okay. Now we can look at lipids. Okay. Lipids are our fats. We've got three kinds of lipids. We've got our fats, long-term energy, storage, insulation, right? We've got blubber in whales and walruses to keep them warm. We've got our sterols or steroids, regulate growth and develop. These are signaling molecules in the body. Then we also have phospholipids, and phospholipids are the cellular membrane. We create a bilayer of these molecules to create a membrane surrounding all of our cells. Okay. Lipids are all nonpolar, so they do not dissolve in water. If you've ever put grease or oil in water, you see that it does not mix. They feel really greasy, and you can store a lot of energy within these lipids, especially within these fat molecules. Okay. You make some homemade salad dressing, mix olive oil, vinegar, water. Notice that when you add vinegar to the water, it mixes immediately. When you add the olive oil, it floats on top of the solution. The vinegar is blank and the oil is blank. Okay, let's take a second. All right, the vinegar is hydrophilic. We can break apart these words. Hydro means water, philic means love. So things that dissolve in water are hydrophilic. Things that do not are hydrophobic. Phobic is a fear. So it's afraid of water and it will not mix. This is important when we start talking about our phospholipids to know these terms hydrophilic and hydrophobic. Okay. Fats. These are delicious, right? Foods that have a lot of fats taste really good. So when we look at our typical fats or triglycerides, we've got two main parts to them. We've got our glycerol head, which we'll see essentially be the same all the time. Then we've got these fatty acid tails. Okay, in the case of triglycerides, tri means three, and so we've got these three fatty tails. Okay, now in this structure, they are solid at room temperature. Okay, and that's where we have all single bonds going through all of this. Between every one of these carbon-hydrogen and carbon-carbon bonds, there's energy stored there. So we can get a lot of energy out of triglycerides. Okay. Fat molecules have a lot of energy, more so than carbohydrates. So we have kind of evolved a taste for these fatty foods, because evolutionarily, that's where we got a lot of our energy from. And if we ate things that had a lot of fat in it, we had energy for a long time. Okay. We've got two types of fats, both saturated and unsaturated. Saturated fats are full of hydrogens. We've got all of these single bonds in here. And so these are typically solids at room temperature. Okay, mostly are animal fats and things like that. Unsaturated fats have double bonds in there, so they're not full of these hydrogens, and so they'll kink. And so we get all these kinks within these fatty acid tails, so they can't sit together as nicely as saturated fats. So these will actually typically be liquid at room temperature, so our vegetable oils and things like that. So this just shows, again, a saturated fat here. We've got our carbons and our hydrogens, and it's full, all single bonds. Okay. Now we've got our unsaturated fat, all of these kinks in there because of those double bonds that exist. Okay. We're nearing our 10 minutes here, so we'll go ahead, answer this question, which is solid at room temperature, are saturated fats. We'll pick up on the rest of lipids in the next lecture.